So just give me a second.
It's already.
Okay, well, there we go. We're rolling. So welcome, everyone. I know we have a small group here in person, and to all of those who are joining us online, and those of you who may join us even asynchronously, we are delighted to have you. So welcome to the American Islamic College. My name is Dr. Timothy Gianotti, and I'm the president and provost of AIC, and I'm very thrilled to be here with my good friend, Dr. Scott Alexander, who's a professor at Catholic Theological Union, a longtime friend of the American Islamic College, and an embodiment of an incredible journey with many transformative encounters. Dr. Shakila, who's with us this morning, Dr. Shakila Hassan, in whose honor we have named this Institute for Interreligious Encounter, has remarked to me over the years that the world is not just round, it's encounter driven. And so today we're going to focus on some of the life-changing encounters of Dr. Scott's life. And we're just going to be thinking and meditating even in our own lives, reflecting on how these unscripted, unplanned, unforeseen encounters leave very, very identifiable traces in our lives and even change the whole trajectory of our life journeys. But before we begin this very exciting conversation, we just want to acknowledge as a community here at the American Islamic College, as a community that is committed to many life-giving principles, including mercy and justice. We want to acknowledge that the land in which we're having this conversation was originally entrusted to the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island. And we can think of the Ottawa, the Chippewa, the Potawatomi nations, and this land which was known and governed by what they called the Council of the Three Fires, this place where the land meets water. And we want to honor them. We want to uphold the remembrance of the fact that their very lives and their culture and their sovereignty was decimated and attacked by the same colonial policy that enslaved and denigrated and persecuted our African American brothers and sisters. Even till today, the remnants of that colonial mentality are not gone. And so we are all in some ways accountable for this. And we are taught in our own tradition that we must uphold justice even when we ourselves are accountable. And even when we ourselves are implicated for the injustices that have happened and the injustices that continue even today. So we want to honor our indigenous brothers and sisters. We want to honor their ancestors. We want to give thanks that we can continue to look upon them as our friends, our teachers, our students, and our alumni. And we want to begin with that very sober and very sincere remembrance. So, Dr. Scott Alexander, there are just so many. You and I can talk forever, and we're just so honored to have you here.
It's my honor, Tim, to be here. Yeah.
But in so many of our discussions, we often end up talking about these encounters. And so, where I'd like to start today, and there's no linearity to the way we have to have this conversation. But I learned from my studies of Greek drama that sometimes the best conversations begin right in the middle of things, in medias res. So I'm thinking of an incredible story that you told me about your first or one of your early transformative encounters with some Muslims in a hospital setting.
Yes.
Can you just begin with that, and then we'll see where we go?
Right. I'd love to begin with that, especially because in some ways it is the origin story for my journey. As a Christian who I think is called by God to learn about Islam and to learn how to genuinely love my Muslim sisters and brothers. So it was back in July of 1980. I had just decided to become a religion concentrator as an undergraduate in that fall. And that spring semester of 1980, I took my first course in Islamic studies, Introduction to Islam. And I was just fascinated and intellectually fascinated, with the richness of the tradition and especially early Muslim history. Spiritually, fascinated and gripped by the stories of the life of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and just really. So that was a kind of transformative experience that was underway. But by the end of the semester, I didn't quite know, what this transformation would turn out to be. And then, that July, my high school sweetheart, who's now my wife of 40 years, sister, was in the hospital for yet another surgery. She had a lot of health difficulties when she was young. She was in Boston Children's Hospital. And we would go in to visit her every day. Karen and myself would drive in. And one day we arrived in July, and we noticed that the room across the hallway was now occupied. And it was occupied by a little boy from Saudi Arabia who had some severe intestinal problems. And so the Saudi government was paying for him to come to Boston to have, the best kind of medical care. First of all, I was impressed the fact that this was not a wealthy family. So the government was just, kind of supporting this family and trying to save this boy's life, which was really impressive to me. And it's when I met Ahmed, we'll call him Ahmed, who was a quiet 24-year-old. So he wasn't that much older than I was, man. And he was accompanying his younger brother, who was 8 years old, and on this life or death journey in some ways. And, long story short, we started talking to one another, and he discovered that I had just taken this course on Islam.
Right.
I think he probably was the first Muslim I ever met, or at least the first Muslim I ever met that I knew was a Muslim. I met Muslims, but didn't realize they were Muslims. And one time I noticed he wasn't eating or drinking much of anything, Now, I had learned about Ramadan,
in class,
right? But I'm not sure I even knew it was Ramadan, which it was, right? Back in 1980. Check your calendar in mid-July. This is like early Ramadan. So I just was going down to the cafeteria, and I said, we were at the point where I felt comfortable saying, "Hey, Ahmed, can I bring you back something?" "Oh, no, thank you, Scott. I'm fine. Thank you very much." Right? So, I brought him back something anyway, just in case, so I brought him back like an apple and some juice or something like that. And he put it aside, very politely. And he said, "Thank you. I probably eat it a little later on." I still didn't catch on, right? And eventually, when I asked him, I said, "Well, you're not eating anything." He said, he put his hand on my knee, and he said, "It's Ramadan, and I'm fasting." And I came to realize, not in that moment, but afterwards, with some reflection, what that fast meant for him, and how much it reflected the depth of his character and faith. Because even though in the moment when we were talking about Ramadan, I didn't quite realize this. Later, I came to understand this is a man who was fasting without any connection to a Muslim community. He had no one with whom to break his fast.
Right.
He had no idea where there was any masjid he could go to, so he would say all his prayers, in the hospital and in the hospital, chapel. And at the time, in the 1980s, even at Boston Children's Hospital, there was no Muslim chapel. No one was aware that Muslims existed and needed pastoral care in hospitals, and just the extraordinary kind of courage and sabr. So he was the first Muslim.
So for non-Arabic speakers,
I'm sorry. So it often gets translated as patience in adversity. I'm not sure that's an adequate translation, but the ability to endure hardship
Mm.
with a strength that you feel comes from beyond yourself.
Mm.
You know? And so it was obvious to me that that is what was happening, you know, with him.
Right.
And I had gotten interested in Islam because that fall, in the fall of 79, the Iranian Revolution broke out.
Right.
And I was seeing all of this negative coverage, media coverage, not just of, you know, the revolution, but of Muslims in general, you know. You know, I talked with him about it, and it was the first time I was able to learn from a Muslim, you know, instead of learn about Muslims.
Right,
And
right.
at that point, I was learning about Muslims, you know, in my class, but also from the media. And thanks be to God, I was at least had the critical acumen to know that what the media was spewing was a bunch of kind of bigoted, racist stereotypes and garbage. As I look back on it, I realized that that experience with him in the hospital, seeing the care he had for his brother and seeing the care he had for me, you know, because he was seeing a lot of things, you know, he was puzzled by the fact that unmarried, you know, I could accompany my girlfriend, right, to the hospital with her father there, and the father not having any problem with it.
Mm.
But rather than being judgmental or asking judgmental questions, he just sort of very gently just asked questions to try to understand.
Mm.
You know, so that sabr, that patience in the adversity of having to do Ramadan all alone, having to be in a foreign culture that was so alien to him, with his brother, you know, in a life or death circumstance, just extraordinary. And it was clear to me that this strength came from his faith. So looking back on it, I know that he had an outsized role in my growing interest in Islamic studies and making the choice to then focus my undergraduate, you know, kind of concentration on Islam and then the rest of the journey.
Wow. Wow. And so as you think about your own journey from there, then, what do you think, where was your next really transformative, life-changing encounter? I know that I'm saving a big conversation for your encounter with Dr. Rossi here, in Chicago. But between that and your experience with Dr. Rossi.
So, I mean, the next set of experiences would have been in graduate school at Columbia, where, you know, I was in the religion department, but doing a lot of my work in Middle Eastern languages and cultures.
Right. And living in a place where there were lots of Middle Easterners, right? Lots of Muslims.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I had two friends. I won't name them because they're scholars of some repute now, and I don't want to do that without their permission. But one who was Lebanese and one who was Iranian. And they were both wonderful human beings. And they were both very different kinds of Muslims, you know, very different kind. But both very serious, you know, about their faith and very serious about their studies. And they had kind of an enormous kind of impact on me because, you know, we'd be in class, you know, studying, you know, fiqh together, for instance, you know, reading fiqh together or reading, you know, Tabari. Tabari is a annals historian, very famous annals historian from the late 9th and 10th, early 10th century. And, you know, there would always be an opportunity for me to learn what these texts meant to them in the context of their lived experience. So I wasn't deprived, as many PhD students I think are, because when you're in some kinds of programs like this, and this program had an Orientalist heritage, maybe in a somewhat benign sense, but still a lot of white people studying, you know, Muslim texts, you know, with a lot of kind of, you know, white Anglo-European questions that they were asking about these texts, some of which were okay to ask and some of which weren't. But I had the benefit, you know, of having this connection with them and hearing the questions they would ask of the text and knowing the degree to which those questions were integrated with their own experience and coming out of their own experience as Muslims. And, that was a very important part of my education. It was not like officially in the brochure, but it was a very important part of my education.
Now, obviously, transformative encounters don't have to be encounters with Muslims, right? So as a Catholic, obviously, this love of Islam and this love of Muslims, right? Because I know that you don't separate those things in your heart, and your love of both the people and the tradition is palpable and evident to everybody who meets you. But within the Catholic tradition, then, what were the spiritual encounters with Catholics who seemed to tell you that this was okay for you? Because obviously, for many, this was pretty exotic, right? I'm sure for your family. I mean,
So first, I want to just address the question. For me, a majority of my transformative experiences, really going to talk about my spiritual journey, are with Muslims. I mean, that's just the reality of it. Don't ask me to explain, why that is exactly. Perhaps if you were to ask me that, I would say there was a lot about my Catholicism that I was trying to explore and understand. I was displaced. I grew up in an Italian-American environment, which in some ways, in terms of a very kind of unapologetically holistic, emotional commitment to the life of faith, not just something that was in the head, but something that was in the heart, came very naturally. And then all of a sudden I found myself, in an Ivy League university environment at the Catholic Center, where people were making fun of me for saying the rosary. And that was jolting, And what I quickly discovered is that like no Muslim would make fun of me for saying the rosary. I mean, that's so intuitively, I think I grasped that Muslims are going to be an important guide and partner for me in my trying to figure out, what my faith journey as a Catholic is going to be. And figure out also had to do with the fact that after my freshman year in college, my high school sweetheart called me and said, I need to know if I'm wasting my time. And the reason she asked me that question is because I thought I may have had a vocation to the priesthood. And for those who might not be familiar with the disciplines of the Latin Roman Catholic Church, if you're a priest, you have to be celibate, and so you can't marry, right? So that question that she asked me was, the most important discernment question, because I think in under 30 seconds, I said, no, you're not wasting your time. But it did raise this issue. So what now? What do I do with this,
vocation?
Right.
Yeah, I'm in a real sense of being called. I can hear that. Yeah.
And then gradually, the answer became, I heard God say to me, like this, I have an answer for you, Scott. Just listen. Like, see the Muslims? Go here, right?
Yeah.
Go here, as a Catholic, and maybe you can help other Catholics. That never became as palpable until many years later, when I ended up leaving my job at Indiana University, where I was just a professor of Islamic studies in the religious studies department, and coming to Catholic Theological Union, where suddenly, I was the director of a program that was not just about helping Catholics learn about Islam and Muslims, but also building bridges, relationships with Muslim individuals and institutions, et cetera. So that was a real kind of homecoming, and it felt providential, because it was like, okay, now I see where God was leading me all the time.
Did you have any transformative encounters through your studies with individuals that you never met in the flesh, or individuals that may not have even overlapped with you? For example, Louis Massignon or Henri Corbin, or any of the, the Catholic Church has a wonderfully rich history of Catholics who loved Muslims and who loved Islam and were so deeply engaged that maybe even the lines between their Catholicism and their love of Islam were a little bit blurry, let's say.
Yeah. So I learned about people like Louis Massignon a little later. I was quite aware of the Catholics who don't fit into that category. The really negatively Orientalist Catholics, Lemon and others who, had an axe to grind. And so I always realized that there was this, well, I was very aware that largely there was this very dark history of how Catholics understood. I mean, there's something called the Crusades, that I kind of knew a little bit about, So
there too.
But I will tell you that my introduction to Louis Massignon was through Anne Marie Schimmel. I mean, because she was my professor.
Yeah, at Harvard.
Yeah. And so, again, at the time, I didn't quite understand what that was. All I knew about her was that she was this incredibly learned person.
Right.
I didn't know that there was a street named after her in Karachi. I didn't know that she was a Muslim herself. I didn't know all these things, about her. But she introduced me to the Awliya Allah. I mean, she introduced me to the friends of God, the friends of God who had already died.
Right.
I was encountering a lot of friends of God, that are not named as such, but the friends of God. And so that was those encounters, those textual encounters, and kind of learning were very important, because as I learned more and more about Sufism, Tasawwuf, I was learning more and more about my own spirituality, obviously, right? I mean, how can you not, right? So that was very transformative. And then, but I also think the fact that when I got to Columbia, a lot of my Arabic studies were in Islamic jurisprudence, because it saved me from thinking that Islam is all about tasawwuf, Islam is all about Sufism, and also saved me from that. Even the Catholics that loved Islam and that there was already that legacy there, like Louis Massignon. What they were attracted to largely was the Sufi tradition.
That's right.
And, wittingly or unwittingly, that plays into this stereotype that, Sufism is the flower that blooms in the desert of Islam.
Right, as a kind of antinomian, kind of lawless.
It's the one thing that rescues the Islamic tradition.
Right.
So Christians are looking for themselves in Islam, and when they look, they find Sufism.
But interestingly, the Catholic tradition is also a legal tradition.
Yes.
And so do you think that your exposure to Islamic law changed your appreciation for canon law? So
I was just having this conversation with somebody who was asking about canon law and Sharia and fiqh. And I said, look, at growing up Catholic, right? I knew there was such a thing as canon law. And I guess I had the sense that it governed my life somehow, right? But as a layperson, you don't really think about canon law. No one teaches you about canon law. It's very different. When I think about a Muslim doing wudu, right? They're not maybe explicitly being taught fiqh, but the way in which, in Catholicism, canon law governs what happens in church. And it might govern what happens when you want to get your child baptized or you want to go get married or something like that.
Right.
But otherwise, canon law doesn't impact your life in a secular, kind of late 20th century, early 21st century context. So, but as a Muslim, Sharia is everything. I mean, it starts,
everything.
It's everything,
Yeah.
So I think, I don't think that while there is something there, that the Catholic tradition does have a tradition of law, more so than other Christian traditions that have seen law as a very negative thing, right? It still doesn't rise to the level, or at least a layperson or myself, that it would, in and of itself, it would give you some kind of bridge to understanding, Sharia.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the opposite, right? So as you learn Sharia, then you revisit the question of church law and canon law, but I think you're right. It doesn't necessarily permeate the life of a layperson the same way that Sharia would.
Right, and for instance, when you get catechized as a child, right? You don't really get taught canon law as such. Maybe it's in there, right? But that's not the emphasis. So I guess what I'm saying is I didn't know much about canon law. I still don't know a lot about canon law. So it's not something as a layperson, were I to have pursued the path of priesthood and have gone to seminary, I would have had to take courses in canon law. And so maybe on that level, were I a priest, ironically, I may have began to see how Sharia could help me understand canon law. But as a layperson that didn't have much of an understanding of canon law, not much.
So interesting. So then, as you journey forward, then, right? I mean, this journey is always going to be a self-reflective journey. Right. So I'm sure that from your first encounter with Ahmed, right, at Boston Children's Hospital and through graduate school, there's always that kind of you're looking at your own faith life in your own practice in your own, and so even now, for example, with the coincidence of Ramadan and Lent, right? Has Ramadan changed your understanding of Lenten observance?
So absolutely, but it's more than that. So Muslim, if we can use the term spirituality, I know it's a Christian term, but Muslim spirituality has impacted my life on so many levels. And the best way I try to understand that process is through the lens of Christopher Stendhal's concept of holy envy. So Christopher Stendhal was a New Testament professor at Harvard of great eminence, actually. And when I was at Harvard, he was still at the Divinity School. And when he retired from Harvard Divinity School, he went to become the Bishop of Stockholm, which is a Lutheran, that's almost like becoming Pope. I mean, it's like, because Sweden's a very Lutheran country. And there was a kerfuffle because the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, wanted to build a big church in Stockholm. And there was a lot of opposition, kind of nativist opposition. And Stendhal was in solidarity with the Mormons as the Lutheran bishop, right? And eventually the church was built and all that, but he was being interviewed by the Harvard Divinity School Gazette or whatever it's called. And the interviewer just asked him, so what are your principles of interreligious encounter that you live by? And he said quite casually, always let the other define herself, right? Never compare my best with your worst. These are just basic things for how to relate to other human beings.
Right.
But the third one, I think, has a specifically religious resonance to it. He said, and always leave room for holy envy. And so the interviewer, picked up on the oxymoronic nature of holy envy. How can envy be holy? He asked him, what is holy envy? And he said, it's when you see something in the tradition of another that you want for yourself. And glossing it, in my experience, it's not necessarily that there's nothing in your tradition, but you're not aware of it, or it's laying dormant in your own experience of your faith tradition or appropriation of your faith tradition. So, the reason why, my prayer life is not what it should be, but the reason why I first, as a lay person, began to pray the Liturgy of the Hours, right, was because of Muslims. Because I'm seeing my Muslim friends pray 5 times a day.
Just for people who may not understand what that is. So that is basically monastic spirituality. So that's a series of sacred readings and reflections that would be interspersed throughout the day, in the same way that the prayer times within the monastic life is, like Muslim prayer, is dispersed throughout the day.
Exactly. So there's like maybe 8 or 9. I'm not sure.
Right.
But the 3 main ones, the 2 main ones are like morning prayer and evening prayer, for instance, right? So so that whole journey into a deeper prayer life that did have a very kind of, not just dua, but almost like salat, in the sense that this is a very structured kind of prayer that also is very communal. Like, other people are doing it. You might not be doing it with them, but you can do it with them if they're there. So it was a way. So my Muslim sisters and brothers and their witness to the importance of prayer in their lives, got me to understand the importance of prayer in my life, right? And then, of course, fasting, or Lent, but given that the three pillars of Lenten observance and therefore Christian spirituality are fasting, prayer, and almsgiving. I think you've heard those three before, right? Because they're three of the five pillars of Islam. So, that also, like, I was kind of became more attuned. I always heard that, like, fasting, prayer, and almsgiving. But once I was studying Islam, fasting, prayer, of course, like, yes. So even as a Catholic, it's like, oh, I've heard those three things. They're part of the arkan, they're part of the pillars of Islam, So, I actually wrote an article about Lent and Ramadan that built off of my experience with Ahmed, interestingly enough, because and helped me just kind of solidify my understanding of his patience in adversity. And that is that my claim in the article is that each of these seasons, right, has a strain of joy and a strain of penitence. Not that these things are mutually exclusive, right? But and that I would argue that in the Catholic observance of Lent, right, penitence is the stronger melody, as you will, right? And then the orchestration is joy underneath it. And then in Ramadan, at least I've always been struck from a non-Muslim perspective that the penitence is kind of the orchestration, but the canto is joy, because, this is every night is kind of a celebration of another day spent fasting and another day spent in fidelity to God. And it's a celebration of not only that personal relationship with God, but the community too, and how the community supports one another. This is the point, right? And I realized that, Ahmed, fasting alone was not like a Christian being in a foreign country and observing Lent. Pretty easy, because it has that penitence. Oh, all the better that I'm in a foreign country and feel cultural anomie. It's Lent. I should feel suffering more intensely. But I realized that Ramadan is like Christmas. There's fasting, but it's like Christmas. Which is just something that in my tradition I didn't realize how those things could fit together the way they do.
Yeah, and another thing that would, I guess, reinforce that is the idea that before it was even a month of fasting, Ramadan was the month of the gifting of the Quran, the gifting of God's revelation to humankind, right? So again, almost like the birth of Jesus, it's the intervention of God's merciful speech and transformative speech in our life,
and therefore a cause for joy.
And so then fasting then becomes a response to that gift, right? Interesting,
right? And I in the past I tried to fast for Ramadan, but my Lenten practice is informed by Muslim fasting practices. To out myself, so it's Lent right now. I'm fasting right now, but I have tea, right? So, in Catholicism, fasting is embarrassingly light vis-a-vis the Muslim understanding. So fasting is one meal a day, and you can have two other kinds of bits of nourishment that don't add up to another meal, and you can drink as much liquid as you want. So my hybrid of a Muslim version is to have that one meal a day, have no other food, but to hydrate myself, sparingly.
We could do this forever, but I don't want to omit the most important encounter, and that is the man that you've referred to as your spiritual father.
Right. So if I can just put it this way, I've been this morning thinking of transformative experiences from our conversation that we had a few weeks ago. I was thinking, okay, and I hope people will forgive the systematic nature of this, but I don't mean to be too heavy with that. But Ahmed kind of introduced me to sabr, to patience. It's an important Quranic virtue, right? And then I met a person who taught me the meaning of taqwa. And then I met...
Again, let's translate.
God consciousness, let's put it that way, right? And then I met two people who taught me the meaning of sadaqah. Now, it's not,
Again,
sorry, that's right. Charity, but in the broadest sense,
Yeah.
right? I mean, not just, giving money or material, but in the sense of when the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, a smile is charity.
Yeah.
A smile at somebody, that's charity. So that sense of caritas, like
Yeah.
love,
Yeah.
like that. And not that any of these people lack the other two, right? I don't mean to say that,
Yes.
right? But so Ghulam Haidar Asi, who
for us is Professor Asi, who's a professor of the American Islamic College for decades and decades, and really was one of the two academic anchors that really held this institution together for a very long time.
Right. And he happened to be on the search committee that hired me at CTU.
So you were already a formed professor, and you'd already thought about all these things, and you were like,
But and I already had very meaningful and transformative encounters with Muslims.
Right.
And I didn't know what was coming with Dr. Asi. So first of all, I was impressed. It was good on CTU that they had a Muslim on the search committee. That was really important. And then I gave my job talk, right? And he was one of a few Muslims in the room. And he came up to me, and this is unusual for people that have never been in academic job talks, right? He hugged me. We had only had like a conversation in a group, earlier that day, I forget about exactly what he said, but what he ended up doing is kind of affirming some of what I was trying to say about why it was important for me to learn about Islam and to have relationships with Muslims of trust and friendship and love, and he kind of affirming that. From that time on, I realized early on that there was no way I could do the job at Catholic Theological Union without having Muslim partners teaching. So, we didn't have money at the time. Since then, we got that money. We have a full-time tenure track Muslim professor at CTU, and he's the director of Catholic Muslim Studies, as it should have always been. But at that time, I had money in the budget to hire adjunct professors. So he and Inam al-Haq, another important figure in the community here in Chicago, just so generously agreed. They didn't do it for the money because the money wasn't very good at all. And I just witnessed. Dr. Asi and I taught Introduction to Islam together. We taught a course on the life of the Prophet together, and the Quran. We taught the history of Muslim-Christian relations together.
Wow.
And maybe the best thing I can say about it is that the transformation in me, his influence on my life was so profound that it was evident to other people. And what I mean by that is when we started to read the student evaluations of our classes together, when we started teaching early on, and there's a question like, what was the most important aspect of this class for you? They would say things like, Dr. Rossi's presence and the relationship between Professor Alexander and Professor Ross. And I would also see that. I remember one time I was, I had to photocopy. It was in those days, I had to photocopy extra syllabi. And so had to leave the classroom just before students were coming in. It was the first class of a semester. And I walked in and I just saw Asi poetry, the students were just around him. And he was going to each student and shaking their hand and welcoming them, I say taqwa because in so many different ways that are difficult for me to kind of recall and specify, he embodied what it means to live a life as if God, this is Hassan too, right? As if God is seeing you, even though you don't see God, right? Like I said, there's too much of what he taught me, about what it means to really seriously try to embody the Sunnah. Actually, I feel like, by the way, he would hate all of this,
Right, of course,
because he's a genuinely humble person, right? And he wouldn't like me saying this about him, but I feel privileged to have learned about the Sunnah, right?
Again, translate.
Right, the lived example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, not only from text, not only from hadith, for instance, but perhaps more importantly from Muslims who embody it, right? Because that's what it is. It's an embodied way of life. It's not, I mean, it's informed by the recorded memories of the things that the Prophet said and did, but it's actually, you got to see it, like, and for me, he was that just profound example of what this was, and taught me so much about what it meant to be a person who professes to want to serve God. And then at the risk of embarrassing some people that are in the room, the next important encounter with two people, Dr. Shakila and Dr. Zia Hassan, all about sadaqah. And I'm not saying sadaqah just because some people might know that this the institute here at American Islamic College exists because of the philanthropic generosity, right, of the doctors Hassan, right? Their philanthropic generosity is just the tip of the iceberg. Maybe what people could see, if they see something endowed by the Hassans here at American Islamic College. Everything about these people was generosity, charity, everything. Opening up their home to me, treating me like a member of the family, my family like a member of the family. I mean, my parents, would always just speak fondly, both about Dr. Asi and the Hassans. And in fact, their encounters with Dr. Asi and especially the Hassans became a source of their own fight as, older white Christians living in Boston, Massachusetts, against Islamophobia.
Can you tell that story about your dad?
This is my father-in-law.
Yeah. Oh,
so my father-in-law, who he's 93 years old now. God bless him, still in good health. And when he retired, he and my mother-in-law decided they were going to do Bible study. Go to this church and do Bible study. And the guy who was doing Bible study had a Master of Divinity, but he was a retired colonel from the U.S. Army. And one day, this gentleman doing Bible study decided he was going to talk all about Islam and Muslims. And this wasn't too long after September 11th. And, I don't know how it was related to the biblical passage, since the Bible doesn't say anything about Islam or Muslims. But anyway, he
just the Ishmaelites.
He must have, maybe, who knows what did it. And my father-in-law was just deeply offended by his ignorance. My father-in-law my father-in-law has an 8th grade education, right? But he reveres education, right? And has always tried to expand his horizons and expand his knowledge, And I remember when he first watched a PBS series on Islamic civilization, and when I saw him a few weeks later, he said, "Scott, I watched this series and now I think I understand why you do what you do." Amazing. But I don't think that series would have been enough for him to stand up. But knowing Shakila and Zia Hassan and knowing Ghulam Haidar Asi was enough for him to say, "I don't know if you know any Muslims." He just stood up, right? He said, "But you don't know what you're talking about." And he said, "I'll respect you have a Master of Divinity. You learned about the Christian scriptures. If you want to stick to the Christian scriptures and teach us about those things from your knowledge, fine. But you're out of your depth."
Wow.
And and everybody, of course, hearing this and that not coming from a Muslim who happens to be offended and has the courage to stand up, but from someone who you might not expect would be doing this. And from that day forward, the guy never mentioned Islam again in the Bible study.
Wow.
Yeah. So meeting the Hassans was a transformative experience for them too, not just for me.
Yeah. You know, it's hard to find someone in Chicago who hasn't had a meal at the Hassan home.
Exactly.
Either you know, the Hyde Park home, or now Dr. Shakila's residence downtown. But it's and that's a tradition. That's a tradition that, as you know, is very much continuing with Dr. Shakila's continuous. I'd never know from one day to the next who's coming to our house for lunch, and
Right.
and again, it's this just this delight in encounter. It's this delight in connecting on a very human level.
But it's not easy encounter at the Hassan, in the sense that, you know, the Prophet, peace be upon him, was known to be a person who could convene conversations that no one else could convene. One of the reasons why he was known as the trustworthy one, Al-Amin, you know, even before he received his prophetic call. You know, it's a gift that, you know, when there might be some conflict or tension in a room, when a certain kind of person walks in, and all of a sudden there's more space in the room because that person walked in.
Right.
And so the Hassan home, right, was and is a place, not just where, you know, a bunch of people who already like each other can come and feel safe, right? But it's a place where people who, you know, might not be sure about how they relate to some of the other people in the room can come because they feel safe, because they know how they relate to the host. And they know that the hosts, you know, see them as possessing a dignity that is inherent.
Yeah, and so we're talking about rabbis, we're talking about, you know, people of every imaginable walk of life.
Right.
We're talking about the entire lineage of Elijah Muhammad, beginning with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Sister Clara, his wife. We're talking about
we're talking about meetings between rabbis and
Minister Farrakhan, minister and the minister. And so you're absolutely right. Yeah. And what I've noticed is that there's a delight in the uniqueness that each and every person brings. And that's something I know that was one of the hallmark characteristics of Muhammad Ali, who just took a delight in every person he met mattered to him, right? Regardless of all the other identifiers that could be associated with that person. And I've seen that in action.
But also a footnote, so I've also seen an underlying joy, but not exactly delight. I've seen a lot of patience also.
Yeah.
And grace, because I've also watched both Zia, may he rest in peace, and also Dr. Shakila in situations where people are saying and doing things that are quite offensive. And so you'd have to ask Dr. Shakila, but my sense was there's not a lot of delight here in this moment.
Right.
But what there is a lot of grace and patience and openness, you know, more than I could. I mean, I would be in situations standing next to her where I'd want to just like strangle the person, basically. I had to do all I can to just, you know, but she could show me the way, just, you know, she's got this, you know, then she can talk to the person. And, you know, because she knew that, you know, the best way to a person's heart, you know, is to make them feel like you're listening and that you respect them as a person, no matter what they might be saying in that given moment.
Wow. Thank you, Scott. We could do this all day,
welcome,
but I just want to thank you for, you know, not only for being here today, but just being a friend to this college. You know, I think that colleges or places and universities should be places of great conversations. And I really believe that this conversation, every conversation I've had with you actually has been a great conversation. And so I think
likewise, and it's been a blessing and privilege for me to be here and to be part of the life of the college. And so I consider it just an honor and a blessing from God.
You know, I think we feel about you the way the Prophet ﷺ said about Salman, that huwa minna al-bayt, that you're part of our family. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And of course, no one has to leave and run because we have refreshments. And for all of you who have joined us online or even outside of the boundaries of time and space, asynchronously, we're just so grateful for your presence. So, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much.